Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're going to begin a study of the book of Jude today by introducing the book. It's a curious book. It's an important book. It's one that is as current as anything else in the New Testament for us today, and yet it's a generally neglected book, and I think I know why that might be. One reason is it's very small and it's wedged between, two great works of John, the John's letters, Johannine letters, and then the book of Revelation. And so its order in the text is somewhat against it. And also its tone is not warm and fuzzy, not in any way. It's a very prickly book to contend with, much like one of the minor prophets. And it's very much like one of the minor prophets, and I think we'll see this as we read through it. Also, about 2/3 of this book is nearly identical to 2 Peter chapter 2, very closely aligned with that work, and we'll talk about why that might be. Jude, at the very beginning, identifies himself as a bondservant of Christ, brother of James, to those who are called, beloved in God the Father, and kept for Jesus. May mercy, peace, and love be multiplied to you. Jude identifies himself by the name Jude and as a brother of James. Now, when we studied James a while back, we talked about the fact that James was not James the Apostle, either of the two Jameses who were the apostles, but James the brother of Jesus that we meet in the book of Acts, that chairs the meeting in Acts 15 to talk about what to do about Gentile Christians, who wrote the book of James. James is the brother of Jesus. And we talked when we studied the book of James about how clearly we heard Jesus' own voice, that James communicated so like Jesus did. And it's almost like brothers and their voices on the phone. Jude, not at all. Jude is not like this. We know from Mark chapter 3 that Jesus had a brother named Jude, and it's interesting that Jude doesn't identify himself as a brother of Jesus, a blood brother of Jesus, not in terms of human blood, but neither does James. James, as we mentioned when we talked about the book of James, was a very well-known figure in Palestine, especially in Jerusalem. He's mentioned in glowing terms in the book of Josephus, and is much more a prominent figure in that book than Jesus himself is. The James that we know from the book of Acts is pretty hardcore. It's James and his representing a narrow faction in or at least being the leader that they look up to, this narrow faction, this anti-Gentile faction of the church, ends up getting Paul arrested in the book of Acts. The people associated with him don't come off well in Paul's writings to the Galatians either. Now, none of this is laid directly at the feet of James, but the man we meet in the book of Acts is pretty hardcore and much more in keeping with an Old Testament prophet than his brother Jesus. This is the voice that Jude takes. Jude to me sounds like the James of the book of Acts, and James in the book of James sounds like the Jesus of the Gospels. But then again, Jude has a reason for taking this tone, because as he makes clear in verse 3, he wanted to write about our common salvation, but it became necessary to write for them to contend for the faith which was once delivered to the saints because of false teaching. As we talked about most recently in 2 Peter, that book dealt with false teachers and a certain kind of false teaching that was creeping into the church from within and radiating out to the congregations, and that's what Jude is talking about as well. He's going to, just like Peter does in 2 Peter chapter 2, make reference not only to somewhat obscure Old Testament events, as well as well-known Old Testament events, but he's also going to refer to extra-biblical Jewish literature That was a curiosity in Peter, because Peter was clearly not writing to people who were Jewish by heritage, not primarily, but Jude probably is. And so if one book is more likely to be a source for the other, I would think that Jude would have been written, and then Peter would have borrowed from Jude, but neither is necessary. They're writing at about the same time, in the early to mid 60s, to address similar false teachings. And of course, both letters were ultimately penned by the Holy Spirit, so that's not an issue either. They're very animated, much more so even than Peter is in 2 Peter, much more about judgment. But then again, as he said, this isn't what he wants to write about. Another feature of the book of Jude that I want to point out to you that was important to me growing up is that Jude writes in threes. In fact, there are so many threes and threes within threes in the book of Jude that it seems to me something beyond the writer's intent. There are times, I really believe there are times, when the structure of a work is just so complex and marvelous that it is miraculous. And it's like the Holy Spirit putting his own signature on the book, saying, I wrote this too. So anyway, you can look for the threes as we study the book of Jude. Thank you so much for joining me for another 5 good minutes. We'll pick up there next time.